Hey, 42 here. We've all woken up after a good night out, vaguely remembering something mortifying that occurred and thought, Jesus Christ, what the hell have I done? But I'm willing to bet you've never awoken thinking, Jesus Christ, why the hell did I think I was Jesus Christ? The same can't be said for a small number of tourists visiting that old stomping ground of Jesus Christ, Jerusalem. Jerusalem Syndrome is a well-documented temporary mental illness. It's been known to happen a few different ways, but the classic balls to the western wall version tends to go a little like this. About 2 days into your visit to the Holy City, one of your group, a family member or a friend, starts to become visibly anxious. This is generally known as stage 1. But hey, everyone gets a bit nervous sometimes. It's not anything to worry about, is it? Maybe not, unless he suddenly declares a need to leave the group and explore the city on his own, because this indicates he's entered stage 2, a major warning sign. In fact, it's at this point the tour guide might suggest a trip to the nearest psychiatrist for a quick evaluation, which may seem a little premature and heavy-handed, but then your tour guide probably knows what comes next, stage 3. The victim will become obsessed with cleaning or purifying himself, along with an overwhelming need to cut his finger and toenails. At this point, it's pretty much a done deal that he'll move on to stage 4, where shit starts to get truly biblical. After making his way back to the hotel, he'll fashion a robe from bed sheets, and in doing so, progress to stage 5, in which he'll start shouting Bible verses or singing hymns, loudly and publicly. This is obviously pretty hard to ignore, so hotel employees who've seen this 100 times before may want to shovel the guest into the back of a padded van before the inevitable happens. He moves on to stage 6 and takes a brisk walk to one of Jerusalem's holy sites. Here, the deranged tourist will reach Jerusalem Syndrome's climax, stage 7, and start delivering an unorthodox, ill-prepared sermon to a crowd of bemused strangers. Needless to say, when you ask your travel agent for a new experience, standing on Temple Mount with your bollocks dangling below your bedsheets, wailing, "The end is nigh" in broken Yiddish, is probably not what you had in mind. Soon enough, the tour group might chance upon the missing friend, no doubt screaming his favourite verse from Revelations into the face of some poor passerby, enough to ruin any once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage. So, is there any effective treatment? Not really, but then it's usually not needed, because as soon as most of the afflicted leave Jerusalem, they're immediately cured, which is great, of course, but you'd probably be slightly pissed off that you've wasted your 2 weeks of annual leave being the Son of God. There's an old joke. If you talk to God, it's called praying. If God talks to you, then you're nuts. And fair enough, there is definitely some comedic value to be had from Jerusalem Syndrome. Israeli psychiatrist Heinz Hermann must have been fully aware of this when he first clinically described it back in the 1930s. Hermann had treated an English woman who was so convinced that Christ was about to return, she climbed to the top of Mount Scopus every morning with a freshly made cup of tea. You know, just in case JC had worked up a thirst on his journey down from paradise. Other cases of Jerusalem Syndrome sound like outtakes from Monty Python's Life of Brian. There was the Austrian chef who walked into a hotel, claimed he was the chosen one, and demanded to be taken to the kitchen so he could prepare a last supper before Armageddon. Or take the American man who became convinced he was Samson and tried to remove a block from the Wailing Wall. Still not doing it for you? How about the woman who travelled to Bethlehem, positive that she was the Virgin Mary and desperately searching for her baby, Jesus? If all this sounds strangely familiar, then you may have seen an episode of The Simpsons called The Greatest Story Ever Told, in which Homer is afflicted with Jerusalem Syndrome. And in Michael Moore's mid-90s show TV Nation, a young Louis Theroux travels to Jerusalem to investigate. There, he discovered, amongst others, John Lichtenberg, previously an air conditioning installer from Brisbane, Australia, who now spends his days dressed as King David, singing psalms and vigorously plucking his lyre. And that's not even a euphemism. Theroux also interviewed Jerry, a firefighter from Iowa who was now sporting a very biblical-looking beard, an equally biblically-looking white robe, and lives in a tent with his family on a hill where the apocalypse is supposed to start. Because, you know, if the end of days is about to kick off, you don't want to be late to the party. Not all cases end in the sufferer remembering he's not, in fact, Moses, but a plumber from Bristol with 4 kids, a mortgage, and a soon-to-be divorced spouse. Some are less fortunate. One of the most high-profile recent cases was of 29-year-old British tourist Oliver McAfee, last seen heading off on a cycling tour of the Negev desert, but was officially counted as a missing person when hikers found his wallet and a laptop, along with a trail of pages torn from the Bible. He'd also left handwritten notes referencing the story of Jesus going into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. As such, it was suggested that this tourist, who was also a devout Christian, may indeed have developed Jerusalem Syndrome. Unfortunately, he still appears to be missing. Luckily, most cases of Jerusalem Syndrome are relatively benign, but there are notable exceptions. In 1969, Dennis Michael Rowan was visiting the city from Australia and became overwhelmed by his God-given mission to clear Jerusalem of abominations so it could be cleansed for the second coming. The following morning, he set fire to one of Islam's most sacred sites, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, an act which led to rioting throughout the city and the rest of the Islamic world as far as India. He was deemed clinically insane and banged up in a psychiatric hospital. Some academics, however, claim it's unfair to blame the syndrome on the city itself, and that Jerusalem is simply the trigger for an underlying mental condition. Israeli psychiatrist Yair Bar-El, an expert on Jerusalem Syndrome, wrote a paper claiming that otherwise healthy people with no history of mental illness are actually in the minority of tourists who experience the phenomenon. Between 1980 and 93, only 42 patients fit the category of regular tourist. But then, it can be argued Jerusalem is an evocative place. A visit to the holy city is like walking through the Bible or the world's biggest budget school nativity. You've got the classic hits such as the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Stations of the Cross, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. A combination of architecture and history that could fascinate even the most hardened atheist, never mind a religious fanatic on a pilgrimage. So, it's no wonder this place inspires those already teetering on the brink of insanity to temporarily devolve into a messianic trance. Jerusalem, quite simply, does what it says on the tin. Well, travel brochure. The same cannot be said, however, for the city that causes one of Jerusalem Syndrome's sister conditions, Paris Syndrome. Paris Syndrome occurs when blissfully optimistic visitors to the City of Light are left in dark disappointment after realizing the reality of a dirty, busy, and crime-ridden city doesn't live up to their expectations of picture-perfect boulevards and quaint cafes. And when I say disappointment, I mean one so crushing it actually affects one's mental state. Hallucinations, delusions, anxiety, dizziness, sweating, and vomiting are all common symptoms. The condition overwhelmingly affects Japanese tourists. In 2004, the French newspaper Libération claimed that over-the-top representations of the city were to blame, especially in Japanese film, TV, and magazines. Paris is often depicted as a place where everyone looks like a supermodel and gourmet food and fine wine are shat out of the sky into your mouth. When tourists are suddenly faced with a littered city full of rude people, the polar opposite of most Japanese cities, the results can be dramatic and devastating. In 2006, the BBC reported the Japanese embassy in Paris operated a 24-hour hotline for sufferers to get support, but the embassy has since denied its existence. Perhaps tiny Eiffel Towers and overpriced coffee aren't your thing. Maybe you've booked your next getaway in the birthplace of the Renaissance. Well, be careful you don't succumb to Florence Syndrome, otherwise known as Stendhal Syndrome. It strikes when tourists are exposed to artworks of overwhelming beauty. This condition is named after the 19th century French author Stendhal, who encountered it himself when he visited the Basilica of Santa Croce, where Machiavelli, Michelangelo, and Galileo are buried. He later wrote that he was overcome with profound emotion and heart palpitations because everything spoke vividly to his soul, which sounds like a poetic way to say he went batshit crazy. Staff at the Hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence are no strangers to dizzy, disorientated tourists who've suddenly felt weird after viewing the statue of David. Mind you, aren't you supposed to feel a bit iffy after staring up at a circumcised marble penis for several minutes? Or maybe that's just me. Whilst Paris and Florence Syndrome are probably no more than urban legends and Japanese whispers, Jerusalem Syndrome is a very real form of psychosis. It pops up again and again in the press, in pop culture and documentaries, and cases remain rife. This is especially true during religious holidays or at times of heightened concern. For instance, the Kafar Shaw Mental Health Centre, which has become the designated treatment hospital, reported a spike in cases on the run-up to the millennium. In 1999, Israel was on high alert, concerned they'd be overwhelmed by religious nutcases, expecting that lovely apocalypse they'd been so looking forward to. At its peak, about 5 tourists a week were admitted with some form of Jerusalem Syndrome. And Israeli Defense Forces were particularly concerned that someone would try to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque again. We're certainly not going to get a vaccine for Jerusalem Syndrome anytime soon, so maybe it's just something to be mindful of on your next pilgrimage to JC's neighbourhood. Well, at least until the real Christ finally gets his act together and comes back like he's been promising. On the other hand, if Jesus does come back, then how are we going to tell the difference between him and, say, Phil, a car mechanic from Manchester who's just ripped his sheets apart at the Ramada Inn and decided he's going to die for all our sins? That carpenter from Nazareth has got a lot more competition than he did 2,000 years ago, and maybe that's why he hasn't bothered to return. Frankly, it seems like a lot of bother. Thanks for watching. You can now buy my new book, Stick a Flag on It, on Amazon, or get the audiobook on Audible. You'll find a link to both in the description below. Thank you.